We can't really have a discussion about a city like London without talking about the global context. It's probably well known to many of you in this room that half the world's population is living in cities, but that number is accelerating very, very fast in something like 35 years, when my son will be roughly my age, so it's soon. 75% of the world will be living in cities. But within that urban whole, there are one or two very, very important issues which affect human beings very directly. One is that at the moment, 1/3 of all urban dwellers live in slums, live in poverty, live in deprivation. What have we got to say about that? And secondly, 75% of the world's CO2 emissions actually come from cities, from buildings, electricity, lighting, air conditioning, and from traffic, cars, and all that. And again, what have we got to say about that? And I think, Peter, this puts this debate of London in a very interesting perspective, because for historical reasons, if nothing else, having been a former empire, being still a country which has some sort of international resonance, though waning, one might say, what London does, actually other people follow and copy. And I think it's important to try and raise that discussion. And unfortunately, I have to say, the more I study cities around the world, the more I travel, say, to Mumbai, Istanbul, or Mexico City, not necessarily what we in the West export to other cultures is of at all the sophistication and subtlety that it ought to be. We tend to dump the worst urban models at all levels of democracy, of design, and of planning visions on many of the emerging cities in the world. So I think that's something worth considering as a background. I think London, despite the recession, which we're told is now finished, there we go, is still growing. The projections from the GLA have slightly been altered, but there's something like 600,000–700,000 more people. That's a very large number of people moving into London by 2015, 2016. So that's, that's a medium-sized city, bigger than Bristol, being dumped on London. What is that going to do in terms of integration and a sense of citizenship when you consider that, in fact, over 90% of the people who are moving into London and have been moving into London over the last 10 years are not just born outside London, they're born outside the UK. So the notion of London as a melting pot, of London as possibly a majority-minority city like New York is, really becomes very important to the discussion about what London is. Who's it for? Who are the new generation of Londoners? How old are they? London is younger than most other European cities, which is a great and exciting thing. And how do you actually build on that? But one has to be reminded that actually even today, and I'm sure Matthew may be touching upon this, but Andrew will in a second, despite the wealth, despite the importance of the service industry, banking, and everything else, 7 of the poorest and most deprived wards in the whole of the UK are in Tower Hamlets, Newham, Southwark, and Hackney, I think. So it's all here. And, it says the level of deprivation is very strong. So questions about what the Olympics might do, what Crossrail might do, will certainly come up. Now, I want to try and frame the discussion and move to asking our panelists some questions in the context of the relationship between the physical and the social. I think, we could talk about citizenship at any level, and particularly with the speakers we have, we could talk about democratic engagement and changing forms of governance. But I think in order to focus this debate in the short time we have, I'm very, very interested to hear what you have to say about the relationship between the shape that we give cities in general, around the world, and in London in particular, and how that can impact, according to you, on the level of engagement of different constituencies, young and old, rich and poor, men and women, children, etc. Anna Minton, who will speak later, has looked at this problem of effectively the emerging ghettoizing world in cities across the UK. We at the LSE have been looking at that around the world, in Mexico City, Sao Paulo, and Istanbul, and I think that will be an interesting thing to speculate. So issues of what does the public realm actually do? How do you make it secure without being secured? How do you make it a place where someone, as Richard Sennett puts it, you can actually feel safe to be alone in a crowd rather than actually being surveyed, is something of great importance to a discussion about the future of London as a city which works to engender and enhance citizenship. So I'm now going to ask the four panelists in a row to speak. Lord Mawson, Andrew Mawson, is an extraordinary figure. He's a social entrepreneur who has really worked with the grain of London, and particularly poor East London, working with communities, particularly in this wonderful project called Bromley by Bow Centre in East London. He, at the moment, and he will speak about this, is involved in something called the St. Paul's Way Transformational Project in Tower Hamlets, and the idea of actually creating a sort of vision for that part of London which is difficult to imagine under the guise of a water city. So I very much like you to welcome Andrew, and Andrew, if you'd like to come up to the platform. Thank you very much.
A very wise government minister once said to me, "Government understands the shape of the forest, but it has no idea what is actually going on under the trees." I think what is happening in a modern enterprise culture is all about what is going on under the trees. I've spent the last 25 years in a housing estate in Bromley by Bow, which is now 250 yards from the Olympic site, worrying about what it means to be a citizen there and how we enable local people to take more responsibility for their street and their area around them. And during that 25 years, I've watched countless government programmes, academics, politicians, policy papers pass our doors. I think I've lived through 19 versions of the NHS. I can't remember all the CEOs I've met. A few things I've discovered in that quarter of a century, three things I mention particularly. One, designing our cities is not about top-down, and neither is it about bottom-up, actually, this naive phrase too easily used, actually, in government. Actually, it's about inside-out. It's about getting on the inside of these communities and beginning to work with the people who are there. And what you begin to see is neither is it about endlessly chasing need, but actually it's about looking for opportunity. And how we took a derelict church and 12 old people and £400 in the bank 25 years ago and created a 3-acre site with 140 staff and a whole range of projects down the Lower Lee Valley wasn't about need, it was about people and opportunity. Secondly, we are the environments we live in. Certain sorts of spaces I began to discover create certain sorts of human behaviour. So we built a health centre of handmade bricks like the ones used at Glyndebourne Opera House in the form of a cloister, actually. And when you then connect a park around it and a restaurant that looks like the Doge's Palace in Venice in the middle of a housing estate, I tell you, within yardstick, not millions and millions of pounds more, no gold taps, actually something begins to happen. And how do you use the capital investment to then trigger social and economic investment? Billions of pounds of investment in East London at the moment, but I see little evidence that government has really understood what that means. And third point, government thinks it's all about process, structures and strategy documents. I don't. I think it's about people and human relationships. What I discovered in the micro in Bromley by Bow is that it's about the people who live there and the connections and relationships between them. How do you shape a city? Well, I'd like to tell you about one street, because any business person worth their salt knows that the way into the macro is always the micro. It is not the other way around. So one street I'm working on at the moment. What is the story? The story is St. Paul's Way is 500 yards to the north of Canary Wharf. It's one of the poorest estates in East London. And 3 years ago, Christine Gilbert, the then chief executive of Tower Hamlets Council, she's now head of Ofsted, called me in and said, "Andrew, will you just go and tell me what is happening on St. Paul's Way? There's young boys with dogs outside that school. There's a lot of violence and there's potential investment. What's happening?" I went and had a look and went back to Christine and said, Christine, despite all the rhetoric about joined-up thinking and joined-up action, there's potential for a new £34 million school, a new £14 million health centre across the road, 500 new homes, 300 for sale, but none of these organisations are talking to each other. Government is passing strategy documents about joined-up thinking into your offices. They change the names on the doors, but none of them have the faintest idea how to churn that stuff into practical realities on St Paul's Way. Andrew, will you help? What do we do about it? I said, I'll take 16 of them away to our conference centre in the Cotswold for 2 days. What do? I put on a meal when they arrive. They're all a bit nervous. I get the wine out and some decent food, and we begin to spend some time together. And I get a really good facilitator called Alison Trimble. And at the end of 2 days, there's unanimous agreement that this is an opportunity to build a new village, a new place, and to discover some entrepreneurial clues about how you really do partnership in practice. Went to Christine. Christine said, you seem to have got unanimous agreement. What do we do about it? Can we create the St Paul's Way Transformational Project? I said, yes, but can I tell you what government looks like when you stay 25 years watching it come past your door? None of these ministers or anyone ever stay long enough to watch the snake coming past your door. Here's Tony's policies, here's Gordon's policies, here's David's policies. It doesn't matter. And every 3 years they come past your door, and in a very chaotic place like St Paul's Way, they add to the chaos of the situation. Actually, what we've got to do, Christine, is put a line right through that snake, actually, and it's a 10-year line. And you've got to have an eye at the top of it about someone who cares about that street, who picks off whatever you can from those government processes, but ignore most of it and build a vision and take people with you. Andrew, will you be that eye that keeps an eye on it? I will. Can I tell you something else? That actually to make something work in practice, you need to get the top, the middle, and the bottom all dancing together. So if I get your directors and the director of the PCT and the housing company, the regeneration company behind it, the middle managers will undermine it. Okay? So I've got to get them on board as well, and then I've got to get this thing on the ground, people who are on that street, all connecting with a narrative. Streets need a story and a vision so that everybody knows how they fit into it. Andrew, if you go and see Kevin Collins, my Director of Children's Services, and he agrees, I'm up for it. I saw Kevin, and I said to Kevin, I don't think it's about strategies and processes and structures. I think it's about people and relationships. He's a modern guy. He says, I agree. We shake on it. We start this process. What you then begin to realise as you wander the street is, here is this school, actually, very difficult school. Across the road is a chemist run by Atul, the chemist, who came here at 10 because his nation got kicked out of Uganda. Set up a little washing machine business in a tent, actually, became a pharmacist, opened up this pharmacy, really entrepreneurial, totally into pharmacies. 2 young Bengali girls came across every morning on Saturday mornings to work with him, totally inspiring. They both went on to read pharmacy at university. The teachers in the school had never noticed. They had 3 big fences around the school. This is nothing to do with them, and he's a business person anyway. Very worrying. What we began to do was to begin to get this narrative happening. And then when you look at the BSF structure, what you begin to realise is, despite all the rhetoric, the structure for this school is still in a silo. The structure for the health bit is still in the silo. As we begin to build the team, the director of the PCT says, I'm now going to take on that health centre across the road. There's 2 GPs in there. Actually, I think they're doing some dodgy things in there. He begins to take it on. You find they've bought a cheap fridge. You find that actually they've got a fridge with 10,000 injections in it. They're all dead, and they've all been injected into 10,000 Bengali patients. You know, this is the reality. All the boxes have been ticked. 6 months later, Andrew comes into the room and says, they're retiring on Friday and I'm going on holiday on Saturday. You deserve the holiday. As we begin to build the relationship, we realise we can put this school here and a new health centre across the road and begin to tie all that actually into health and jobs. There are thousands of jobs in the health service in East London. No school is specialising in it, becoming a doctor, a pharmacist, etc., etc. We have now brought that together. We have now got the £34 million school coming out of the ground. We have raised £1 million to put in a new science complex called the Faraday Project. We'd all forgotten that Faraday did all his experiments down on the Isle of Dogs, actually with electricity at Trinity Buoy Wharf, and he was a fantastic innovator and entrepreneur. Read his stuff. It sounds like today he wasn't an academic theorist, he was a hands-on, practical guy, absolutely relevant, actually, to young people if they're going to get a job in the modern world. As we began to do that bit of the street, the bishop on the end of the street said, well, I've got an Anglican church and a primary school next door. Can we join in? Because I can sort that bit out. I can sort some other bits of plant further up Devon's Road. Yes, the council is now playing for a development brief. You then find the Catholic church on the other end of the street 800 Vietnamese people from across London using that church. No one had noticed, actually. Can we get one of them, surely one of them's a restaurateur, to come into this parade of shops and get a decent restaurant there? In 3 years from a standing start, where nothing was happening, relationships, some structure, buildings are starting to happen. What I call the sticky ball approach. Over the summer, I hear Transport for London suddenly get hold of the planning department and say, this is one of the best examples of partnership in London. Can we give you more money towards the street? Because this is what it's meant to be about, the designed environment of the street. What had happened through many of our policies about equal opportunities, all that wonderful theory? Actually, over 30 years, you've ended up with a white East End estate in the Leopold estate and a Bengali estate in Burdett, with a road in between, what one resident called the other week the Berlin Wall, with all the social complications of all of that. The first 3 years has been like looking into a jigsaw box and getting all this mess out, piece by piece upon the table, and beginning to put it together. We have changed the head teacher at the school. I went to the IEB board last week. He's been there 6 months. We've had to remove 27 teachers, who've been playing politics with children's lives, and the results have just begun to turn. Leadership. It's about vision, leadership, and design connecting to the people who live there. Unless the people who live there become the co-creators of this street, I'm sorry, we'll invest millions of pounds, but little will change.
I would like to start with a quote of a very famous Viennese writer, Karl Kraus. He said, "What do I need from the city? A good working infrastructure. Comfortable, I feel by myself." So I think that it describes the problem of the city anyway. I just came back from China, and I have to say, what I saw there made me very happy to live in a European city. Because what I could see is that this society is in a big change, but they repeat the mistakes we did 50 years ago. So that means they think they are progressive, but they are way back in developing new ideas about city planning. We are happy to live in European cities because they were built by a very rich bourgeoisie with a great infrastructure, and we profit from this infrastructure still. So, but we made mistakes in terms of not facing the future development of a city. The decision makers, which I can understand and almost appreciate, are facing pragmatic problems, and they have to find pragmatic solutions. What I'm missing as an architect and urban planner is programmatic ideas. So we jumped into a research which is quite interesting, comparing the growing and working of a human brain with the growing and working of a city. And we could find some points of departure which I can describe very briefly like this. The brain is not hierarchically organized, neither democratic. So the synapses are not connected to each other. The brain decides, our brain decides, according to the problem the person is facing, which system he should use in order to solve the problem. That means we can learn a lot about strategies, how we can turn over negative problems into positive, like our brain is doing. We did a research overlaying the growing of the brain with the growing of Sao Paulo, and we found out that the problem zones in our brain are really according to the problem zones of Sao Paulo. So that means the slums, the increasing of the slums can be mapped on the brain map, so to say. So this is one thing. The other thing I think we can learn from Muhammad Ali, the great boxer, namely a very, very fascinating strategy. He was a boxer who could change his strategy during the fight. He was flexible enough to do so. And on the other side, and this is very important, he could spot a problem before it becomes a problem. I think this is the most exciting strategy we can learn from to transplant into a city planning issue. So two things we have to face in the near future as architects. This is to reinterpret the public space, and the other one is we have to face a new aesthetic for sustainability. If we want not only save energy, which I think would be a very bad thing, but to create energy, then we have to find a new aesthetical issue so that we can interpret our buildings into a power station. That means we have to design the upcoming future buildings according to the paradigms of climate issues. That means codes and rules of our cities have to reinterpret it again. So that means the future buildings have to reflect sustainability in the meaning of creating energy, not only saving energy.
But say just a little bit more about what you mean about reinterpreting public space. Help us understand. You must have an idea of that.
In former times, I think the church and the nobles, later on the bourgeoisie, created the public space. There were money. Now the cities don't have money anymore, so we have to invite, let's say, brands, companies, to take the place of the church and the nobles and create a win-win situation, like we did with the BMW building. We, as architects, have to discuss with the client that it will be a profit for them as well if they give more just only their own interest. They have to give back the spaces to the public, so not only making profit spaces, but also spaces which we as the public of a city can use without paying.
A central part of the argument of my book is that it's, in fact, urban design itself, which I feel has been part of a process which is creating a less democratic public realm. And I've been examining how and why that's happening and what can be done about it. The context for this is the huge amount of change we've seen in British cities over the last decade, witnessed by the construction which has been going on in every city until the cranes were sort of silenced just recently with the financial collapse. And the context for that is the shift to a post-industrial economy, which opened up large parts of the old industrial city to new development, so quaysides, old docks and waterfronts, warehouses and former factories. All these incredibly attractive places have created huge opportunities for development, and it's been the greatest amount of construction since the post-war period, since the 50s and 60s, which put their own particular stamp on cities, and we know the mistakes that were made then. And part of my argument is that actually we're putting our particular stamp on cities now, and perhaps we should be thinking a bit more carefully about what we've been doing. Because in the last 10 years, we've been creating places in a very specific way. And I've been drawing comparisons with the rest of continental Europe and saying this is a particularly British approach, which has been taking a great deal from American policy approaches. Virtually all new development in British towns and cities today is on an entirely private model in a Canary Wharf or Broadgate-type sort of template. That was set out in the 80s. Those were financed districts. They were exceptional places with private security guards, CCTV. But now all new development projects are rolling out in this way. So, for example, Liverpool 1, High Cross in Leicester, Bristol's Cabot Circus, little developments sort of all around London, and, of course, the biggest of all, Stratford City. And what I'm arguing is that this is creating a very different public culture and public life, which actually makes places more fearful, more sterile, less diverse, and very importantly, less democratic. And an increasingly fearful culture is part of the consequence, because, in fact, security has very counterintuitive effects, and it's our growing obsession with safety and security in these private places that is actually creating more fearful places. Security guards, CCTV, and what's called defensible space architecture. And this removes the personal and collective responsibility that people have for their own safety and for the safety of each other. Jane Jacobs' famous term, natural surveillance. This type of security-conscious architecture is undermining that natural surveillance and consequently diluting trust between strangers. And you mentioned earlier the quote from Richard Sennett about
the ability
to feel safe in a crowd, sort of surrounded by that natural surveillance. There's more direct impacts on a democratic environment as well. These places, in fact, restrict access and they restrict behaviour, who is or is not allowed in and what they're not allowed to do there. So, in fact, a whole range of activities are not allowed, from the seemingly harmless, such as skateboarding, rollerblading, taking photographs, filming, to perhaps other activities which verge on very sort of vital sort of social issues about which we need to have a proper debate, homelessness, selling the big issue, antisocial behaviour. But more sort of direct political activity is also banned, so handing out political leaflets, demonstrations, and I hear all the time anecdotal stories of people who are moved on by security guards. And in fact, I mean, this happened to me. I was interviewed by the BBC for a piece on this at the South Bank, and we were just by a security guard who, in fact, started questioning a group of young people and asking a young girl if she could pull her jeans up because they were just sort of slightly worn low, as is kind of quite common nowadays. And then we were, in fact, ejected from that particular part of the South Bank because filming and audio isn't allowed. And I mean, we almost couldn't have set it up better to illustrate the points I'm trying to make. These places are essentially private property in the same way that somebody's house is private property. So they do not abide by the normal rules of the rest of the city. So my main point is that it really doesn't need to be this way. It wasn't this way 10 years ago, and it certainly wasn't. I mean, there was plenty of private investment going into cities. This is not an argument against private sector development. There is absolutely no reason why the streets have to be privately owned and privately controlled. And you mentioned the importance of the street. And, you know, this is at the centre of my argument. What has been happening is that government policy, a combination of factors have all come together to silently hand over control of the public realm. And what we've seen happen is that we've created these shopping mall environments in the centre of our cities, which are called by their critics in the States malls without walls. They function on exactly the same template. And I don't believe it's necessarily what the public or even what developers want. So in this context, what can design do? Well, I'd say not too much within the constraints I've just described, because it's a far wider issue. But there are aspects of contemporary design which are working in tandem with the sterility of these environments. And this is the emphasis on design as a way of controlling criminal behavior. So defensible, security-conscious architecture based on the idea of designing out crime and the popularity of policies known as secured by design has a big role to play here, and I think we really need to look at that again. However, having painted this sort of fairly gloomy picture of where our towns and cities seem to be going, towards the end of the book, I really genuinely felt that there were a lot of causes for optimism. One of them was looking at trends from continental Europe, which are increasingly coming over here, and that's the enthusiasm for shared space, which is Exhibition Road is now going to be removing railings and barriers to create sort of more open street environment. Kensington High Street has already done it. It sounds like a small thing, but actually it's a very different way of looking at the city, and I think the same argument applies to security. Shared space relies on the interaction between people rather than external controls. So the same thing we should look at the same things with regard to security. And just finally, my other cause for sort of optimism was the financial crisis and new economic models, new ways of looking at our city spaces. A lot of the spaces I've described have been very much part of the property boom, fueled by speculation and debt, and it looked as though we may be starting to think about new alternatives.
Thank you very much, Anna.
What questions should we ask? I guess that's my focus. Wolf talked about brains. Let me start with brains. One way to understand the dilemmas that we face is that we have brains that evolved in circumstances of relative continuity throughout nearly all our existence and have suddenly been confronted in the last few decades with revolutionary change in our circumstances. So we have prehistoric brains trying to cope with a modern world. And one way of thinking about this is that we are in the midst of three great transitions. And you have to excuse me, by the way, if I generalize. Someone once said to me, generalizations are more important than sex, which I thought was ridiculous. And then they said to me, have you ever been a week without a generalization? Three great transitions. A transition from people who lived in cultures where culture itself changed very slowly, traditions changed very slowly, where there was deference to gods of nature, gods in the sky, monarchs. Transition from people who lived in close-knit, homogeneous communities where they knew everybody else around them. Transition from people who lived without any sense of there being too much of anything. There was just enough to survive. Where do we hope we'll end up? Well, we hope we will end up being people who are able to govern themselves autonomy as reflexive subjects. We hope that we will be people who joyously inhabit a global village of diversity and engagement and tolerance. We hope that we will become people who have a rounded, holistic account of what the good life is to be. But arguably, we find ourselves, in relation to these three transitions, stuck in a rather uncomfortable space. The space of teenage years. Richard Sennett has called it the teenage years. I think Kant described the Enlightenment, the period he was in, as the teenage years of Enlightenment man. That was some time ago, but this teenage era, as is often the case of today's teenagers, is going on and on and on. So we're caught in this transition, a period when we are unwilling to be governed but not yet willing to govern ourselves. When we have abundance but we don't know quite what to do with abundance, and so we are subject to all sorts of epidemics which result from our inability to have the right kind of lifestyle to suit the way that we are. So obesity and social isolation are two of the biggest epidemics in the developed world. And we find ourselves deeply uncomfortable about issues like identity and just the pace of change in our lives. So we find ourselves in the middle of these periods of transition, this point of transition, where what will get us to where we potentially could be, well, we will need to be aggregately different kinds of people. We will need to be more engaged. By that, I don't mean simply that we vote. Voting is just a way of getting rid of governments we don't like, as we will discover in a few months' time. What I mean by engaged is people who understand the kinds of trade-offs and challenges involved in governing a society like ours. Part of the reason that we have a public spending crisis is because the outcome of a consumerist politics that tells people that they can have their cake and eat it and leave without paying. It's interesting that if you ask people now what they think needs to be done about the public spending crisis, they say, we're screwed, but it shouldn't have to affect me, when in fact the reverse is true. We're not screwed, but it's going to affect everybody. Secondly, we need to be moved towards a more self-reliant way of thinking about the world. It's very interesting that President Sarkozy, not somebody I associate particularly with great Enlightenment thought, commissioned a major piece of work by a number of economists, world economists, some of the leading economists in the world, that was published last week, calling for a redefinition of GDP, much more based in notions of well-being. And Sarkozy is now going to argue for this to be adopted. And thirdly, we need to be, as citizens, we need to be more other-regarding. We have to find ways of reconnecting to the social fabric, understanding what is necessary for society to flourish. And in this regard, we should always remember, I think, the story, cliched though it is, of the American students who studied, theology students. They were broken into two groups. One group studied the Good Samaritan story. The other group studied a completely unrelated story. As they walked away from the lecture, they passed a stranger in obvious distress. And the question is, were those who heard the Good Samaritan story any more likely to help than those who didn't? And the answer is no, no more likely at all. Indeed, the only determining factor which distinguished those who helped and those who didn't help was that those who helped had were in not so much of a hurry. That is to say, there was space in their minds to listen to the voice of their mirror neurons blasting away, saying somebody is in trouble, imagine what it would feel like if you were in trouble, therefore you can help. So what drives human altruism is not speeches by politicians or vicars. What drives human altruism is a set of social circumstances which lead us to behave in a way which we are hardwired to behave as long as we get the right clues. So let me leave you then with three questions that come out of this and which will take us back to the subject matter. You'll be pleased to hear that I'm going to return to the subject matter as I finish. So the first question is this question I've been asking, which is who do we need to be, and how is it that our buildings and our spaces and our services can give us messages about who it is we need to be. If you look at the buildings for the Victorian municipal era, they tell a very powerful message about who it is that people are supposed to be. But it seems to me that meaning-making has gone out of a great deal of architecture and design, and we need more consciously to be in the business of meaning-making. Secondly, moving to a different level, given that neighbourhood is the level, even in our hyper-connected, socially networked world, neighbourhood is still the most important, and there's overwhelming evidence of this. Neighbourhood is still the most important place for people to create social meanings. This is an interesting question. How socially viable are the 1,000 neighbourhoods of London? Because there are neighbourhoods, like Andrew described, whose viability is problematic because of the sheer diversity and level of change, but also, you know, as somebody who drives to Croydon every Sunday to deliver my sons to football matches, I drive through places. The problem is not their diversity or their level of change, it is their drabness, their lack of feature, their lack of anything other than mile after mile of drab housing. So if we were to look at 1,000 neighbourhoods in London and ask how many of these feel like socially viable neighbourhoods, how many of these feel like the kinds of places that will give the kinds of clues that we need day to day in order to release that capacity for altruism that is hardwired into us? It would be an interesting question. And then finally, and I finish with this, what does all of this mean for the public sphere? A project that we're undertaking here at the RSA is called Schools Without Boundaries, and it asks this question: why is it that we think of schools as an oasis of learning and a culture of unlearning? Why do we not see schools, as Andrew vividly described, as beacons of learning whose job it is to create a culture of learning in the communities that they occupy? Because if children go to school and they're at school for 20% of their waking hours and they have no inclination to learn, they will not learn. And so what will you have to do in those schools? You have to constantly intensify the process. They'll have to be involved in every single part of a child's life, and well-being and emotional development and physical development and fighting obesity, and they'll have to intensify the exam process. And so you'll end up with schools which have this remarkable mixture of being both stressful and boring. But what would it be if schools said, no, actually, we're not interested in intensifying the 20% like British Leyland workers forced to, a car comes down and it's a complete mess and you have to do what you can in a little bit of the conveyor belt. Let's actually do to society what the Japanese did to car manufacturing 30 years ago. Let's say, how do we influence the rest of the 80%? How do we influence the rest of the conveyor belt? How do we as a school ensure that that which is delivered to us at 9 o'clock in the morning is somebody who wants to learn, who feels confident of learning, whose parents understand about learning? And surprise, surprise, many schools reaching the end of their tether in failing to achieve anything in the 20% have finally engaged parents and community leaders and achieved transformative results. So how do we remodel public institutions around this different kind of model of who we are and the citizens that we need to be? And let me end on a final controversial point. When we are talking about this, and we're talking about the importance of meaning-making and symbolizing a notion of citizenship, why is it that we have let go of the idea that the Olympics will be an Olympics that prizes participation? I spoke to somebody the other day and I said, why do the Olympics not involve people more? And the person said, oh, it's easy to be involved. You can go and visit the site. We are tourists now. We are tourists in relation to these Olympics. We won these Olympics by pictures of children from diverse backgrounds participating, and we said this would be a people's Olympics. Where has it gone? Where is the making of meaning around the Olympics happening? Now, maybe there's a great plan. It will soon be unveiled, but I don't see it, and I find it, at the moment, depressing.